Hello, everybody, and welcome. Can you hear me now? Perfect. That was a great start. I hope you can all hear me. Susan is waving at me, so that's good. We have lots of people still joining the call, but we wanted to get started as we've got a really busy packed schedule ahead. I wanted to say hello and to welcome you to this symposium, Children and Heritage, which is being co-convened by the Centre for the History of Childhood and the National Trust Partnership here at the University of Oxford. My name is Alice Purkis, and I lead the National Trust Partnership here at the university, and it's been my real pleasure to co-convene this event with my Oxford colleagues, Dr. Oliver Cox, Dr. Jennifer Crane, Professor Catherine Gleadle, Professor Sian Pooley, and Dr. Helen Sunderland. We have also been ably supported by Ben Crowther, who's been emailing many of you over the last few weeks. Ben is the National Trust Partnership Support Officer here, and to our two AHRC doctoral placement students, Isabel Kemp and Joanna Smith, who will be running our social media presence over the next 2 days. So we've had an incredible response to our call for papers that went out earlier this year, and we received 65 proposals covering an enormous range of topics, geographies and periods in history. So over the next 2 days, our speakers will explore children's interactions with history and heritage in the past, young people's engagement with heritage today, the inclusion of children's voices and lives within historic spaces and exhibitions, and historic collections related to children's lives and experiences. Keynote papers today and tomorrow will be presented by Professor Susan A. Miller, who is on the call and who's been waving at me, which has been lovely, and also Caro Howell, who is the director of the Foundling Museum, alongside contributions from a range of academics and heritage and museum professionals engaging with children and heritage from around the world. I just wanted to give you a bit of background very briefly on kind of where the topic of our symposium came from, and it's been the result of a developing collaboration between myself, Professor Sian Pooley here at Oxford, and curatorial colleagues at the National Trust, who will be presenting tomorrow. So our colleagues Dawn Hoskin and Lucy Armstrong-Blair. Histories of Childhood is a focus for collaborative research through the University of Oxford National Trust Partnership, and it really felt like a timely focus for the Centre for the History of Childhood's annual symposium. And welcome back to many of you who I know will attend annually, and also welcome to anybody who is new to the Centre for the History of Childhood on behalf of my colleagues who run the centre. We're really delighted to be joined by colleagues from across the heritage sector, but in particular from a number of National Trust colleagues as both speakers and attendees over the next 2 days, including also members of the wider International National Trusts organisation, INTO, and we'll be hearing from colleagues from INTO tomorrow. We're enormously grateful to Magdalen College, Oxford, Torch, the Oxford Centre for Research, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and the National Trust, who have sponsored our event. And we are particularly excited to have the opportunity to be at Magdalen College for tomorrow's sessions, for the first time for many of us to see each other in person, and to look forward, and we also look forward to seeing some of you there, but also online too, if you're not able to join us in person. So it's just up to me to do a quick bit of housekeeping before we start. As you can tell, we're using Zoom webinar for today, and we just ask for your patience as we just work through any kind of technical challenges we might have, but we hope everything will work really well. We're not using the chat box today, therefore please submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A function that you'll find along the bottom, and they will be able to see them there, so the chairs will be able to find those as well. We particularly ask that you have your name listed correctly in your Zoom name. It's very easy to do. If you just click on your profile, you'll be able to change it. It just means that we can identify any of our speakers for today if we haven't done already, and we will promote you just before your session to be a panelist so that you'll be able to share your slides. You'll see that closed captions have been enabled at the bottom of the screen, but you are welcome to turn them off for yourself if you want to. It's quite easy. Click on the CC at the bottom. If you're having any issues accessing the Zoom, please email Ben at ntpartnership@humanities.oxford.ac.uk. Ben's been in contact with you lots already, so you should have his email address. Isabel and Joanna, who I already mentioned, who are our AHRC doctoral placement students from Oxford and Royal Holloway, they will both be tweeting throughout the next 2 days from the Centre for the History of Childhood's Twitter account, which is at HistChildOxford, using the hashtag #ChildHeritage22. So we'd love for you to join in and continue the conversation over on Twitter, if you are a tweeter, that is, and if you want to get involved. Our presenters today will each be sharing their own screens and their slides, but just to our presenters, if you're having any problems, we will have them ready to share our end too, so there's no need to panic if you're not working out how to do it or it's not working your end. The sessions today and tomorrow are being recorded for those of you who have agreed to be filmed. If you've not agreed to be filmed and you can see that the Zoom is still recording, it will be edited in due course. We'll be sharing the recordings on our website after the event, and we will circulate these to attendees once live, so you can share them or watch them back to your heart's content. So that's the housekeeping from me. You will hear from me again today because I will be stepping in for my colleague Dawn to chair the second session this afternoon. But it just leaves for me to hand over to my co-convener and the chair for our first session today, Dr. Helen Sunderland, who will also be introducing our keynote speaker. So Helen, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Alice. Hello, everybody. Yeah, it's fantastic that you can all join us. Yeah, and it's lovely to see so many people here. I'm really delighted to be chairing the opening session for this 2-day colloquium on children, heritage and identity. We've got 4 speakers, 1 keynote, and then 2 following papers. And I think our 4 speakers really kind of represent the rich interdisciplinarity that we're going to be sort of hearing from over the course of these couple of days. So both kind of people working on the history of childhood, but also heritage practitioners, thinking about kind of how people are actually engaging children and young people with heritage today. And the speakers today also kind of show the real kind of broad geographical scope of the research that's being done in this area. So just to kind of briefly outline the structure of the session. So this session will be an hour and a half. We'll end at 3:30. So first of all, we'll have a keynote speech from Susan A. Miller, who will introduce properly in a moment. Then I'll give some brief sort of thoughts in response before kind of passing on to our 2 other papers. And I will introduce the speakers when we get there, and hopefully we'll have kind of a good sort of half an hour session at the end for Q&A. And yeah, I'd really kind of welcome kind of questions in that moment, but also if you've got questions kind of as the papers are going through, please do feel free to use that Q&A function. So Al Saloon from Liverpool School of Architecture. Attar is a lecturer in architecture and urban heritage at the Liverpool School of Architecture. She's an architect and has previously worked in private practice in Syria. She has a PhD in cultural heritage studies from the Liverpool School of Architecture, where she's been a full-time lecturer since 2007. And Attar will be speaking to us today on heritage in diaspora. What is my identity? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Helen. I will share my screen. Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Attar Al-Saloom and I am a lecturer in architecture and urban heritage at the Liverpool School of Architecture. Today I'm going to present heritage in diaspora, what's my identity. The armed conflict in Syria is one of the many current world catastrophes. For the last 10 years, Syrians have been on a quest, hoping to resettle inside or outside Syria. Resettling in the UK would provide shelter, access to education, and other human rights. However, conflict between own heritage, presented in everyday practice, and parent sociocultural behavior, and the desire to fit in the new society presents one of the key challenges Syrian children are facing in their new home. Adverse consequences on mental health and the search for own identity, which might be escalated by the host community's verdict of being a refugee who is unfortunately displaced, are urgent issues to be addressed. The key questions in this presentation are: how could we create educational strategies for these children to learn about their heritage and be proud of it? And how could we help them learn and decide on their own identity? Learning about tangible heritage such as buildings, history, and destroyed places they left behind is important, but the intangible heritage underpinning inherited traditional practices in everyday life is in urgent need to be understood and appreciated. And to be honest with you, it's the one thing that their parents and maybe themselves have when they are displaced. So my presentation today is based on the design of 3 workshops with school children. We collaborated with the Arabic school in Liverpool. Also, we have a Syrian British Cultural Center. It was one of our partners in this collaboration. The workshops were planned around 3 educational activities extracted from elements of the intangible cultural heritage of Syria. These are shadow play theater, al-Hakawati, and Arabesque. Of course, all activities took place online because of the COVID-19 restrictions at that time. So Shadow Play Theater Workshop introduced the children to some elements, characters, stories, and part of the history of Shadow Play Theater in Syria. We managed to deliver the materials to children's homes, and they were supervised by their parents or guardians during the activities. We planned the workshop for 1 hour. I was really amazed how the children followed the instructions and they were able to create their own shadow play theater in their own way. We tried our best to capture a few angles of the work while we are doing it via different devices online. So this was one of the challenges, but to be honest, I was very pleased with the results. We also provided simple but friendly materials to work with. We provided an instruction booklet in both languages, in English and Arabic, hoping that the children will get some help also from their parents. After that, we re-recorded the story we told them, and we tried to deliver a message via that story. So part of the shadow play theater, mainly we use 2 characters. They have been traditionally the main features of that part of intangible heritage. And within the story, we told them about places in Old Damascus. We told them about the bazaar, about some of the goods sold in that bazaar. And as you can see, you know, the characters are visible from the outside of the shadow play theater, and they are really fun, and they present really entertainment as well as educational strategies and activities as well. Actually, some of the children asked many questions at the end, and some of them also asked us if we can run this on a weekly basis. Of course, we can't. It was only a one-time workshop. However, I have to say that in last May, we managed to run further 2 workshops, face-to-face workshops at the National Museum of Liverpool. So this was really very enjoyable, but I'm not going to present them here. We can see here some of the children work. Also, I would like to highlight that we have written consents from all the parents in order to use the photos, of course, only for academic purposes. So we can see here a child who is starting with the material at the beginning. And this is some finished work by some of the children at their homes. The second workshop featured a traditional storyteller or hakawati. And of course, we were joined by a young lady who is practicing hakawati as a hobby. She told us the story in Arabic rather than in English because we wanted really to deliver the actual tradition used to, the actual traditional stories used to deliver in the cafe or in like when people used to gather and listen to al-Hakawati. We also designed some activities to alongside the story, and again the workshop was for 1 hour. So the children worked on creating tarbush. Tarbush is the traditional hat the Hakawati used to wear, particularly when telling the stories. Again, we did our best to capture different angles of the work in order to enable the children to follow us online at home. And we try to do this step by step, simplify the activities, deliver the material beforehand. And this is my finished tarbush, and this is the work by 2 children at home, and honestly, these are much better than mine. We can see here another child working on creating the tarbush here. And we also chatted to the children at the end. They asked us questions. Also, we received really very encouraging feedback from both children and parents. The final workshop targeted older children, teenager between 12 and 17, because it included some more maybe a bit difficult activities. It introduced Arabesque pattern making, which is a traditional Syrian craft. And of course, the workshop was successfully introduced, and of course we provided the material. We tried not to provide any sharp elements or objects, so we tried to create safe environment at home as much as possible. Of course, the parents highlighted that the activities encouraged them to talk more about their heritage with the children, and some of the children were proudly speaking about the activities among their classmates in school after the workshops. This is why we were encouraged to run further workshops in Liverpool and in person as well this year. We can see here actually some of the children working at home with us on the Arabesque workshop. This is one of the children work. This is another work. We can see how, despite the fact that all of them were working on the same pattern, but they have colored it in their own way. So they follow particular instructions, but at the same time, they can provide their own identity within that work. Again, one of the children very proud of his work. To be honest, after receiving the feedback, there was a consensus among all the Syrians I collected feedback from and I had conversations with, that raising awareness about intangible cultural heritage elements and its importance has a massive role to play in reconciliation and in providing a sense of identity. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Atta. That was really wonderful and great to see so many photos of the children enjoying all the different activities. Thanks so much. So our final paper of the day is from Lucy Grimshaw, who is here with us. Is Lewis Mates joining as well?
No, it's just me today.
No, that's absolutely fine. So yeah, we're delighted that Lucy Grimshaw is with us today, who will be speaking on Our History, My Community's History, Children's Heritage and Community-Based Partnerships. Lucy is a senior lecturer in social policy in the Department of Social Work, Education and Community Wellbeing at Northumbria University. She's a social scientist working within the fields of urban and childhood studies, whose research focuses on community development, gender equality and pedagogy. Over to you, Lucy.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that will work. Hopefully you can see that now. Just struggling to, that's what I want to do, just swap the presenter view and slideshow. Okay, so hopefully you can see that now. Thank you. I'm going to spend 10 minutes talking about the importance for children of learning about their urban post-industrial heritage and the importance of community-based partnerships in driving this type of learning and how learning about local heritage contributes and shapes to children's sense of place. Which is important for that sense of identity. So the title is a quote from a child during a focus group when we asked if they thought it was important to learn about local history, and this particular pupil said, well, yes, of course it is, because it's our history, my history.
Hi, Lucy. I think we've lost you. Oh, there you are, Helen, as well.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know if Lucy, if you can still hear us, but we can't hear you. Oh, Lucy has gone. We might just need to wait for Lucy. Ah, you're back, Lucy.
Hello,
Perfect.
sorry, I was just saying, I think my internet connection went there. I'll share.
Don't worry. Do
sure.
try again. If your connection doesn't work this time, let us know and we can share it if it helps your internet connection.
Okay, I think that's, you can see that now. Can you, the screen?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's classic, isn't it? Okay, so the project was driven by a local community-based partnership. So local community leaders from a mining heritage association, which set up in 2011, a primary school, which was a key part, and then 2 universities where Lewis and I work in Northumbria and Durham. And the children involved were primary school age, so around 8 to 10 years old. And it's important to just say that the locality is kind of one of those classic ex-mining areas, working class families, low income, and the coal mining in the area ended in the 1970s. So it didn't go through all the political disruption that we had in Britain in mining areas during the strikes and eventual closure of pits in the 1980s. So there's a lack of physical remnants in the area. You can't necessarily identify that coal mining happened there unless you know you have the mining knowledge. So that was also a fascination for us, trying to understand, what the children thought about learning about this history and this heritage when there was no physical remnants and perhaps not the stories passed down. So we applied for a heritage lottery grant, and this project took place luckily before COVID in 2016-17, and we really took part in observations of classroom activities, interviews with the key players, the adults, and also focus groups with the children themselves. And what was exciting about the project, I think, was that it was underpinned by this idea of place-based pedagogy and practice of this type of pedagogy. So teaching about urban heritage across the curriculum, not just in history, but as you can see in the pictures, in geography with maps, in maths with and in art and design technology, and also through music and singing songs. And it was, so the learning and teaching took place in school, but also outside. Experts were brought in as part of the project. And there were also trips to local coal mining museums and regional museums, as well as learning walks, and also participation in the big Durham Miners Gala that takes place every year. And you can see a picture of that in the bottom right-hand corner, but also local galas as well, and marches to celebrate key people and events in the area. And what we wanted to think about was this sense of place, and how a sense of place is intimately connected to our individual life histories, following on from Bell Hooks, who says that, you know, talking about place and where we belong is a constant subject for many of us, and we want to know if it's possible to live on the earth peacefully, but many folks feel no sense of place. And that's certainly what the teachers and the mining activists wanted to do, was to recapture those working class histories of what it used to be like and what that means for the present and then perhaps for the future. But also we followed Lowen Altman's discussion or a concept of a sense of place, that it's an interplay between affect and emotions, knowledge and beliefs and behaviours and actions in reference to place. So it's about the physical and natural environment, emotions, relationships, but also, of course, the history, traditions and rituals and myths that circulate within communities and across generations. And how we thought about this, and this is based really on some publications that Lewis and I have published recently, but there are 3 ways that the children made sense of place through learning about local history. One was that quote about it being my history, my community's history. They increased their knowledge of local history and their heritage. And as a result of that, saw connections to the past through past relatives as they went home and discussed mining heritage with their families. They rediscovered or discovered relatives that had worked in mines and brought that back to the school. But also they started to think about the danger and had a sense of pride because of the dangerous nature of these jobs. And there was a key mining disaster in this local area. So they thought about the sense of pride and the role their local community and people within it played in local, but also regional and national progress and events. So they began to own their history, and that was a huge transformation that we saw. They talked about owning their history and talked about that when they were adults, they might write books on this because they now knew so much about it. So a real sense of excitement of learning about their history. And also it was about making sense of place through using their senses, following on some work by Anne Bartos in 2013. We saw how the children made sense of their history by using touch and sight and smell and taste and sound and hearing, which fueled their imaginations. So some of the quotes there, I won't read them all, but you know, Jeff says there, it was exciting because we got to see like all the old things that miners actually used to use. And Jeff Bob talks about the helmet that people wore. He thought it'd be really heavy, but actually, he thought it'd be quite light, but actually it was really heavy. And when they went to the mining museum, they heard the sound of the mines. So this really fueled their sense of imagination and connected them to their history and to the people that used to live in the local area and work in the local area. But also music was really important, and that sound of hearing songs that were sung about mines and perhaps during the time when the mines were in their area, they learned the songs. And as Tiddles there said, the children chose their own names, so some of them are quite funny. He says, you know, I like the music because we learned information in the song. It was fun. You didn't just talk about it and learn it. You were actually singing it, the information. So the different ways that they interacted and learned about history was really important across all of those subject areas. And then finally, Rhiannon talks about the particular dialect in the Northeast. It's, for those of you not familiar, we're Geordies in the Northeast, and we have a dialect Geordie. And lots of the children had that dialect, but what they found was, you know, that although they're Geordie, as Rhiannon says, different words were used in the past and in the song. So they learned new words and rediscovered words that perhaps some of the parents had forbidden them from using at home. So they were able to see that and see that the heritage of the language that they were using on an everyday basis, and that connected them to place. Then finally, just this way of thinking about a sense of place through embodied sensory emotions, you know, and really the excitement and pride and fear and gratitude that they felt, that the sense of place became meaningful because of a complex set of embodied sensory emotions that the children experience within their own environment. So walking around, they imagined coal beneath. On the beach, when Jeff went on holiday, he found coal everywhere, and they kind of understood that now. But also the physicality of pretending to be miners in the old mines, and how you had to go on your side, and it was quite cramped. So just to give you a flavour of what the children thought about learning there, about their local history, and just briefly to conclude that what we found in the project was that learning about local heritage develops that sense of place, which is fundamental to identity. It develops through the emotions, the physicality, and engaging the senses and extending knowledge by learning about stories and tradition and landscape. But also to remember that these working class histories, it's not an exercise in offering an uncritical, nostalgic rendition of the past. And it's about remembering past harms and hardships and dangers, whilst also fostering a pride in forgotten events. And sometimes that has offered a source of strength to marginalised communities. It's about the present, but also the children make connections to the future, to passing on these stories to future generations and their own children and their grandchildren, even in one case. But also the teaching approach matters. The community-based partnership was central to driving this forward, but also the place-based pedagogy and critical pedagogy that empowered children to participate and take ownership of their own heritage was really important as well. I've gone a little bit over, but that's the end. Thank you. Thanks very much for listening.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Lucy. Yeah, really fantastic paper. I think really interesting stuff about kind of sensory history and history of emotions there for us all to think about. I'd like to invite all of our speakers to turn their cameras back on as we start the Q&A session. We have just about half an hour, which is a lovely long time, which is excellent. Not sure whether Susan Miller will be rejoining, but perhaps if behind the scenes one of the other conveners could try and track her down, that would be fab. We have a question in the Q&A, and I definitely invite more of our attendees to post questions in there if you have questions for our panellists. That it would be really wonderful to start with. Oh, great. Hi, Susan. I think Professor Sumit Mukherjee's question is a really good place to start, this kind of question about the connection between the local, this kind of place-based heritage, and either sort of socialization at a national and global level, thinking about how kind of children engage with heritage on different scales. So it'd be fantastic if our speakers could kind of speak to that question about whether children do encounter kind of different levels of socialization or identity through the local and through a sense of place. Thank you.
I don't know, Helen, if you want me to go first on that.
Go
Sorry,
for it. Absolutely.
That was directed at me.
No, to everybody, but yeah, kick us off, Lucy.
I think it's a really interesting place a thing to kind of discuss that. Things that I've missed out in the presentation because it's only 10 minutes, but that idea of a sense of place where people have different, that varies according to time and spatial levels and so I think there is a connection, and I think there's an idea of nested allegiances to a sense of place. What the children in our project did, I forgot to say that they actually, as a result of the project, had connections to people in the USA and in Turkey who'd had a connection to mining, who came to visit the school. So there were connections to kind of other countries. And the teachers the head teacher in particular, talked about the way that if learning about mining at local level connects you to those other spatial levels. And she talked about, the experience of having refugees come to the school, or the idea that children in the future might meet people from other countries and be able to talk about this mining history. So they had a connection there that might be something that hadn't occurred to them before. So that kind of idea of kind of common and global working class histories having, connecting to each other. So yeah, so I think I might think again about something else, but that's for now, I think, my answer to that.
Yeah, for me, to be honest, I totally agree about what Lucy has just said, because in our experience, actually, not in the online workshops, when we did the workshops on site in just a couple of months ago, we did like a tour at the Museum of Liverpool where the children learned about Liverpool itself and its, of course, particular accent and how different words were used, previously. Actually, the museum has a whole like floor about that and about some of the elements of the intangible heritage of Liverpool. And then they were able to really connect because they are struggling, some of them, the majority of them were born in Syria, but they came here like 9 years ago or 10 years ago. So they have lived here and they feel that they belong. However, am I Syrian? Am I British? What I'm doing here? So, having that tour in the museum and learning about Liverpool itself and its history, and maybe in the future learning more and more about the UK, it will help them, live here and have a stronger sense of place. And maybe this will help them to shape their own identity in their own way. So I hope we answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Susan, would you like to come in on that as well?
I'm still thinking, Lucy, about the kids kind of thinking about the coal under their feet and picking that up. And I think that materiality, it speaks a little bit, Helen, what you were saying about that this what we often think of as a childlike urge to collect things, right? To grab these physical objects. And I think about trees a lot, both in a sense of youth organizations wanting children to understand the kind of what a tree is in their neighborhood, to say, hey, these are the elms and they're here, and these are birch trees and they're not here anymore because they died from blight. Similar to the community, Lucy, that you were saying, this mining community that's gone, that has left no trace. And then I think about the ways in which sometimes these trees in the US and some of these groups we would consider a little bit more conservative, think about trees in this very odd national way, that they get, they actually take a little chunk of wood from like the Lafayette elm, like the tree under which Lafayette gave his speech or under which Washington like left the troops, and they make it into gavels or tools to use in the meeting of these patriotic organizations. So I see these objects and trees functioning on all of these levels. So thanks for bringing me down to like the coal under the feet too, because that's super important. But I think that there's always this conversation about it's a local and it's symbolic and it's national, and sometimes these they're contested. Sometimes these visions.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting for thinking about kind of natural heritage as well as kind of more of a built environment kind of heritage, and coal being sort of a strange one that fits between the two, the natural resource, but then also the infrastructure and industrialization around it. We've got a really good question from Alice Perkis, our convener for today. And she's really interested in this theme of intangible heritage and how that's come up in all of the papers this afternoon. And she'd like to ask you all whether you think children are more engaged in the intangible rather than tangible heritage.
Shall I start that? So in terms of intangible heritage, because, the definition is a bit complicated. So intangible heritage, let's say, according to the UNESCO, they have divided it into 5 themes. So including oral traditions, festives, and maybe traditional skills, etc. So what happens is the children, they are practicing this heritage every day with their parents. For example, prayers, maybe they pray with their parents, they prepare traditional food in using different ingredients and maybe different techniques or different strategies. And then, for example, there are some particular festives, there are some particular social occasions, such as maybe birth or marriage, or even grief sometime. So they are witnessing something different among their close social group. However, they were not able maybe to understand what does that mean, why is this different than what I have outside with my friends in the school or etc. However, in terms of heritage education, it's really, really important to pick particular elements. It's not easy, but you need to focus on a particular element and then try to process that and create a methodology and easy to follow steps, children-friendly steps, and then, you know, teach them the larger context. For example, in the Arabesque workshop, we taught them that Arabesque is a pattern, but it was before, you know, it was since the Greek, you know, it was much, much before the Arabic or Islamic patterns existed. And then, however, this was transformed in that particular era. And then it was used in the interior and exterior design of many buildings. And we showed them examples of those buildings. We also told them that even Arabesque is visible in small objects they might have at home. For example, I have something at home like this one, and it has like some Arabesque design, and this is very, very common, you know, in Arabic, you know, or Syrian houses. So they were like connected. They started to understand what is that. And then when we started the activities by following like step by step, we started from a blank A3 paper, and then they were, you know, following us, and they end up with that pattern, and then they enjoyed coloring it. So then they are connected. So the answer is we need to find a methodology and strategy in order to create a particular pathway for them to learn about the elements. We need also to be selective, you know, in our like education strategy, and we need to be creative as well, and to try to simplify it as much as we can.
Excellent, thank you. Lucy or Susan, would you like to come in on this very large question about children's engagement with kind of intangible or tangible heritage?
I think that's right, Helen. It's a really big topic, isn't it? And it's made me just think about lots of different things about what is intangible and tangible, and also the kind of lots of things that are unsaid about our project. So in terms of the politics of mining, and you know, you talked about the natural environment, and there's obviously a whole climate change debate wrapped up in some of this that didn't come about, and in the classroom, you know, the politics of coal mining and how, you know, it was kind of destroyed in the 1980s. You know, those things were kind of kept hidden, and although there were conversations about that, it had to be in particular ways, but it did. Having those conversations was really useful, because the children then, you know, there were comments. One of the comments that stands out, and we put in one of the papers, is, suddenly that's, you know, that's why people don't like Margaret Thatcher around here. And so the children could make sense of that history, and comments that they've heard. You know, you can imagine they've heard that somewhere from, you know, around the, I don't know, in the homes, or, you know, on the news, and just to have that sense. And so it was clarified for them and made kind of more tangible, I guess, in a way. But obviously the school had to tread a fine line there as well, because they have to be neutral, and there are, you know, there is legislation about what teachers can and can't do in classrooms, and that's kind of come to the fore more recently as well, about, you know, talking about issues to do with Black Lives Matter. And so the teachers have to be sensitive as well about those conversations. Yeah, there's probably a whole lot more to say, but the politics of it for me was something that I probably didn't get across so much, but I've been thinking a lot about recently, actually.
I think that so thanks for that, both Ata and Lucy. I think the politics of it, I mean, that's what I'm kind of bumping on. And I think as a historian, when I think about this, I was thinking about Helen's question. You had asked if maybe children were performing pageants, you know, that were affiliated with this back home. And I don't know the answer to that. But in a way, I feel like a lot of the conversation about kids kind of doing plays and, you know, getting in the spirit of pageants, it requires the tangible. Like they have to have the props and the costumes and the stuff to put on, because I think there's this and I think it kind of dovetails a little bit with what Lucy was saying, that there's a danger that the intangible, which I think of more as stories, right, as fiction, can be a little dangerous, that children's imagination is both that which gives them access to this imagination that I was talking about in my paper, but it can also be a little bit tricky, because if their imaginations kind of run wild, then they don't necessarily get the right story. So that the intangible in the hands of kids can be this little precarious position for some adults, right? That they want to kind of lock it down a little bit more than that. And I don't have a particularly well-formed thought about it, but I think it has to do with some of the political stories and which ones kids are going to pick up on. And my sense that the materiality is seen by adults, at least, as a way to kind of anchor kids and kind of guide the story a little bit to the end that adults are looking for sometimes.
And sorry, just to come back on that, I think that was the beauty of the teaching, because it was so kind of diverse and across the curriculum, you know. So they got stories in music and in songs, but they also got, you know, in geography, they got other stories about the natural environment and why the landscape around is as it is. But also in design technology, you know, there was a huge debate about who developed the first miner's lamp, and the children did their own research and had a debate in class about that. So lots of stories in lots of different ways that, you know, children will have picked up on, some but not others. And yeah, that's the interesting thing, isn't it, what they take forward.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your thoughts on that. There were just a couple of questions in the Q&A that I thought I'd flag, so hopefully you can all see those from Audla Genek. So firstly, for Atta, just a comment about your project being really interesting, and this has made Aud think of a couple of other projects, and there's a link there that you might want to follow on as well. And then Aud's other question was to Lucy, but I'm interested in extending this to Atta as well, about kind of processes of sort of evaluation, and kind of whether you can maybe sort of in a brief kind of summary give us a sense of kind of the impact of, or at least kind of how maybe the challenges of even sort of trying to kind of measure the impact of the projects.
I think just, I mean, there's kind of a brief answer and then a longer answer. So that briefly, the focus groups that we did with the children and the interviews really were about evaluating the project and exploring the impact of the teaching and seeing what the children thought about it, what they liked, what they didn't like, and what they really thought about learning local history. So in a way, that was a way of evaluating the project, and also asking the teachers about what they thought and their reflections on the teaching and what they would improve going forward, with a kind of action research element. So we have a website as well that we developed that can be used as a guide for other teachers. It is obviously a long time ago, and I kind of think I blame COVID, but also I'm a fan of slow scholarship, and the pressures are immense, aren't they, in academia? So I think I keep thinking, in fact, I was just saying to Lewis the other day, wouldn't it be lovely if we could go back now and ask the children, you know, 5 years on, what they think, what they remember about learning about mining history, because they were so excited every time Lewis and I came in the classroom. They'd say, yay, it's mining history again. And, you know, no matter what lesson it was. So it would be really nice to go back, I think. And part of the reason that I was interested in doing the project in the first place was because of my own experiences of learning about history at school and reflecting on the kinds of things that I remember, that I kind of feel that have shaped the way that I see life. And, you know, learning about the Industrial Revolution in Yorkshire and learning about the slave trade in first school have really impacted, I think, on the way that on what I research and what I teach and how I am really in terms of my feelings of social justice and you know, all those things, and equality. So yeah, I think it would be really nice to kind of find time to write a grant to go back and see if we can find some of these children who have moved on to secondary school, and we kind of know which types of schools, which ones they might have gone to, so it might be possible to find them again. But yeah, I think it's a good point and question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, yes, measuring impact is very tricky. And, you know, just asking the children, you know, via focus group, or maybe like sending forms for evaluation. And, you know, our project is still, you know, new, because we did these workshops like last year. But I think what I heard from the parents that the workshops encouraged them to talk more about their children and to explain more about particular aspects of heritage. This also has encouraged more like the parents to show their children photos about some historical buildings in Syria, or maybe talk about a particular event they used to do with their parents. So however, I believe there is an impact, and to measure such social impact is the most difficult thing you can do in academia, because you need time. And I think, as Lucy said, to go back and have a conversation with them, this would be fantastic if you can have that, because then you will measure, you will really show evidence of that impact. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I think that's really interesting about the kind of intergenerational experiences and kind of discussions on heritage that these kind of quite specific kind of projects can generate. There's a question from Claire in the Q&A function. So this is for Susan and Lucy. And whether you've come across any problems with children understanding chronology. So for example, kind of applying information from maybe sort of a longer kind of period ago, like kind of child minors and kind of child labor in 1800, to kind of the more recent past and kind of the 1970s and the closure of the pits, or any kind of sense of the difficulties of understanding chronology.
Well, I just want to hop in there and say the problem isn't with the children, it's that paper mache dinosaur and the caveman in the pageant of America, which really, when adults are willing to do that with, as far as I can tell, with no sense of irony whatsoever, but really putting this over as a lesson, we don't have to worry about it. I think, but in seriousness, I think, and I didn't talk about it as much as I could, but, you know, I think particularly for the things that I'm often interested in this sense of patriotism and nationalism, it's actually desired that you skip over, that you link your own past with the more distant past, and particularly in the US, you know, in terms of race relations. And obviously we're seeing this with conversations about monuments and what should stand and what shouldn't stand. You know, there is this whole movement in the States at this time, you know, in the 1920s and even a little bit earlier, to like skip over the Civil War as much as possible and pretend that this didn't happen, and do what historians talk about as the reforging of the white republic. So in fact, it's imperative that you don't think historically, that you do kind of just jump over this and, you know, launch yourself into this kind of, you know, vague, cloudy space where you can, you know, feel your ancestors present. And the one slide that I have was you know, the physical buildings, but then it was like these ghostly figures of the founding fathers. And that in fact is desirable. So I'm not sure that anybody's really worked up and worried about whether or not kids are thinking historically. I think you know, the idea is that they shouldn't, for some of the purposes, particularly of heritage and national identity.
I think that's a really good question, and it's I don't know if you're a teacher, but there is a focus, isn't there, in the history curriculum, particularly on kids in the UK learning that chronology. For me, I'm not a historian, so I was never so keen on dates, but I think what it does give, and I don't know the exact answer. We didn't question them, we didn't test them on, you know, the different days. But what I think it does give to them is actually a sense of progress over time. And in terms of, you know, I mentioned the kind of progress in terms of health and safety. There was a big mining disaster in the local area, and they learned that had a massive, you know, that influence then and changed health and safety policy nationally for the better within the mines. And they knew that things had improved since then. But also what it does is enables them to compare and contrast times as well. So, you know, they learned through songs about strikes, and they also learned about the 1980s strikes, and they could see the way that, you know, there were similar issues regardless of the timeline or the period. So they could see that there was a sense of continuity, I guess, in terms of thinking about history and thinking about the broad map of history, I guess. So a sense of continuity, again, through the songs, but also thinking about you know, recent history of miners having to migrate around the country for one reason or another, either to kind of break strikes and work instead of striking miners, but in the kind of 19th century, compared to as the mines began to close, people would move around. So yeah, I think it gives them a bigger picture, and they certainly understood that the mines had improved over time and it was better. And for example, girls and women didn't have to work down the mines at some point. Again, I'm not a historian, so it's not my key thing, but I think it gives them some sense of chronology. But we didn't test them on that. So
thanks very much. I think it's really interesting, I guess, sort of questioning why kind of value is placed on kind of a chronological kind of model of heritage, and then also kind of engaging with, I guess, as Susan was saying, the politics of erasure around kind of what periods in history are celebrated and which ones are silenced. If anyone has any final questions, please do put them in the Q&A. In the meantime, there's a question from Sean Pooley, one of our conveners. This is for all of the panelists. And Sean said that all of the papers have made her think about Susan Miller's journal article on agency as assent. And she'd like to know whether, or kind of how far the children contested narratives that adults, maybe kind of family members, parents, grandparents, were presenting them about their past. Or do we actually see generations largely agreeing about how to narrate their past? So are the children kind of contesting the messages, or is there kind of consensus about how to kind of tell stories about the past? So yeah, another kind of meaty question for you all to tackle.
I think, I can just offer kind of 3 examples of how they did do that, actually. And at the end, when we did the focus groups, the children said, well, we'd like to learn more about what happened in women's lives at this point. We know they were at the pit head, but what else did they do? What were their lives like? And so that the gendered nature of working class histories and working history, is often about men, isn't it? And men going down the pit and working and driving areas. So they wanted, there was that comment from them that they wanted to know more about women. And they had, I'm not sure if it's contestation, but they definitely had debates in class about, as I said, the miners' lamps and who developed it first. There are 2 key men that claim that they produced the first miners' lamp, so the students were able to do their own research and make up their own minds, actually, and knew that it was contested. So they had a sense that it was contested history. And I did have another example, and with the strikes as well, they went against in one class, the teacher did a workshop, did some worksheets, and then at the end said, and who would have gone on strike then? Or who would have gone to work and broke the strikes? And actually in complete kind of anathema really to the Northeast working classes, or most anyway, this class said, yes, we would strike. But in another class where they were talking about music and striking in the past, they all said, oh, of course we wouldn't strike. So they had a sense of the debates, I think, and I think that was really good about the teaching as well. They had the sense that these things were not set in stone and they were contested.
Atta, would you like to come in on this sense of kind of whether children were kind of disagreeing maybe with some of the messages, or whether there was a kind of shared intergenerational consensus about kind of the stories of intangible heritage?
Yeah. Sometimes they were asking questions about particular things, because in some houses in Syria you have like segregated places, rooms for women gathering, other rooms for men gathering. So they were asking why did that happen and what does that mean? Additionally, sometimes the majority of them, they are working together like boys and girls and in the same classroom, but sometimes there are some particular guidance from their parents that no, boys should be together, girls should be together. So they were a bit asking about the tradition behind that. And even I noticed that some of the parents, they have already have like 2 rooms in their houses, for example, because this is one of the traditions they inherited from their ancestors. Yes, so it's really tricky, and the politics behind this and behind intangible heritage is not an easy debate, and we have to be careful, you know, how we deliver that and how we communicate with the children, because they, of course, they reflect, they ask, and they question, they compare, but I think our aim should be always clear that we would like to deliver the knowledge to them. We would like them to learn more and have fun while learning, and in a neutral position. We can't take any side. We can't argue about if this is good or bad, or if this is incorrect or correct. So I think this is what we can do at the moment, but then the impact should be on, like, maybe raising their awareness, heightening their knowledge, and encouraging them to read, to learn more about that. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We're just about over time, but Susan, over to you for any final thoughts to close off this discussion.
You should not have given me that position, because I don't have an answer to that question. I'm just at the start of trying to find any of the kids. And so what I want to say is, mostly it seems to me that they didn't really care very much about the heritage lessons, and they were certainly there for the ice cream. I mean, that seems to be the message of the press. So.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Yeah, this has been a really fantastic panel to kick off the couple of days. So yeah, thank you all for everything you shared and for your generosity in the discussions. We've got a 10-minute break now. So yeah, feel free to stay on the call if you'd like to. But yeah, we'll come back on at 3:40 for our next panel. So thanks so much. See you soon.
Hi everybody, and welcome back. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you so much to the speakers and to Helen for chairing the first session. It was really, really fascinating. And we're going to continue the discussion now with the second session of today. We have 4 speakers. Originally we were due to have 5, but we have 4 speakers today. And they are going to be thinking about experiencing the past today. So we will be hearing from Barbara Gribbling, John Winder, Ord Lagernek and Claire Rose. And first up, we will be hearing from Barbara Gribbling. So Barbara is a visiting scholar at Newcastle University. Her recent work investigates children's everyday experiences with British history and heritage from 1750 to 1945, from visiting Madame Tussauds to playing with historically themed toys and games. And Barbara is going to be talking to us today about touring the past, children, tour games and play in heritage education, 1760 to 1840, brackets, and today. So Barbara, we have made you a co-host. Oh, there you, I can see you, wonderful. So hopefully you can share your screen.
Yes, can everyone?
Wonderful, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alice. So I'll make a start. So today I'd like to talk to you about tour games, which were a way that children engaged with heritage sites and entertainments remotely in the past, and how a Newcastle project where we recreated online one of these games to see how it might be adapted for children today. From the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, tour games of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and even London, were popular middle and upper class family and children's entertainment. Games like the British Tourist and the Panorama of London, as seen on the slide, allowed players to visit and engage through play with ancient and modern buildings, industrial marvels, and entertainments. These games were also used as part of children's education in lessons in schoolrooms and homes. And so you can see, for example, some of these ancient and modern sites and industrial marvels with Highgate Archway and Carisbrooke Castle. The closure of heritage sites during COVID-19 and the need for home and online learning resources offered an opportunity to think about different ways of accessing heritage sites, including how children engaged with sites in the past, something I've been investigating in a larger project with Professor Matthew Grenby, who will be speaking about that tomorrow. In 2020, I embarked on a 3-month project with research software engineer Dr. Kate Court to digitally recreate an 1820s board game, Scenes in London, for children in line with Key Stage 2 learning outcomes. Through playing the game, children engage with material culture, are asked to think about the experiences of children in the past, and for London-based children, can explore their local environment in the past. Scenes in London is a playful race to the finish game featuring 18 squares with different sites and attractions, which allowed children to become historical tourists on a visit to the capital. On the first game screen, a tower raven, chosen for its familiarity, invites children to travel back in time to London in the 1820s through the board game. And you'll see throughout we have different audio, so all the characters speak. Children are asked to choose whether they'd like to race around the board or play the explorer mode. In the race around the board mode, children play a digital version of the game in its original form. They can play against the computer or another child, and they can choose their game piece or mark from different objects and characters taken from the game, all of which have their own unique sounds. The mummy creaks, the actress has applause. As virtual guides, we created the characters of Arthur and Edward, a father and son. Arthur and Edward appear in various scenes and squares, so had a similar but less visible role in the original game. In our version, they tell children they must reach the Bank of England to win, but they also explain that there are so many things for children to do in London that it won't be easy to make it to the bank. Players move around the board using a digital teetotum, a spinning top used instead of dice to move forward, and they have 24 counters, which they will lose and gain throughout. The original game was intended to replicate the experience of visiting a site, modeling through play how children should engage with it. And we've recreated this experience with players paying 3 counters to see the tower curiosities, including the crown jewels, stopping at the British Museum 3 times and waiting 3 turns to see its contents, or even having the authentic historical experience of having their pocket picked at Vauxhall Gardens and losing their counters. The game also has a hierarchy of sites, with players who land on the monument being sent back to explore the Tower of London first. In contrast, Explorer mode offers a new way of engaging with the sites, giving children a sense of historical place through activities. Children are introduced to the board by a yeoman warder, again drawn from an illustration on the board. The yeoman warder, James, sets the scene and explains that this mode enables players to enter sites in the 1820s, as child visitors in the past would have done, and engage with them through mini-games. The prototype includes mini-games for 3 sites: the Cosmorama Rooms, the Tower of London Horse Armoury, and the British Museum. Players who click on the Cosmorama Rooms are greeted by a fashionable woman dressed in 1820s attire, who explains that the rooms are an exhibition space where viewers can peer through the glass to see pictures of animals, cities, and battles. Clicking on one of the viewing points, players can explore a panorama of the City of London. And we chose the Visser panorama, which depicts the city in about 1600. So children can think about how things have changed over time. And they're asked to search and find different sites and characters in the panorama, from Shakespeare and Elizabeth I to St. Paul's Church and the Tower. The sign Create Your Own Curiosity shows the potential of the Explorer mode to introduce other creative games on site, just as the Cosmorama Rooms would have different exhibitions at different times to attract and entice patrons. Players who click on the Line of Kings or the Horse Armoury at the Tower of London meet our first real historical character, Samuel Rush Merrick, an antiquarian expert in arms and armor, and who is our addition to the game. In real life, Samuel made complaints about the Line of Kings exhibit and reworked it for more historical accuracy. He asks children in the game to help him with his exhibit, noting that someone has mixed up the kings and he needs to put them back in order. In this memory mix-up game, children can click on a king for clues, and he will tell him about his life and reign. The cards will reshuffle after a child wins, offering the opportunity to play again. And I used sketches here of the re-envisioned line of kings, the more historically accurate ones from the period, to design the cards. The game also allows children to play with another earlier mode of history and heritage education, card games, with children's publishers in the period creating cards depicting royals, famous figures, and sites in order to teach or use in lessons. To conclude, in our last Explore Square, a guide introduces children to the British Museum, noting that children aren't normally allowed in and asking for a ticket. Thus, children are made aware of the British Museum's restrictions on child visitors in the 1820s, though there were exceptions. Like visitors in the past, contemporary visitors must follow the guide, and children play a search and find game for animals and objects in the first room, engaging with the museum space in the past with a note about a mix-it-up opportunity with new objects coming soon. To conclude, this prototype enabled us to digitally recreate a popular British history and heritage themed educational board game and adapt it for play in a contemporary digital environment. By developing two different playing modes, it allowed us to explore the different ways in which children might have and could engage with heritage remotely. It also gave me a new and deeper perspective on these types of games, and it was quite fun to do. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. And I think there'll be lots of questions for you around the kind of the history of these games themselves and the role that they played, and also how you use them with these young people today. So really, really brilliant. Thank you. And just to remind everybody, please put questions in the Q&A and we will have some time at the end with all of our panelists. So next we will hear from John Winder from the University of Kent. John has recently completed his PhD in the School of History at the University of Kent, and he is an early career member of the Royal Historical Society and a postgraduate fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. And John is talking to us today about children's place in heritage landscapes. So John, are you able to share your screen with us?
I shall have a go. Thanks,
Thank you very much. Perfect.
Can you see the presentation?
We got presenter mode, so we can see it, but we got your notes as well. If it would be helpful for us to share, we can do it for you. Ben has it ready here, and if you want to tell us to go forward.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Ben,
That's
are you okay to do that?
Is that something
I'm looking to my left because Ben is sitting next to me. You wouldn't know because although Ben hasn't been on screen, so there we go. Perfect.
It's the trouble with having two monitors, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
I need to learn how to
there
do
we
that
go.
properly.
So
Brilliant.
if you just say next slide,
I'll give the
that
word.
would be great. Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Alice.
Over to you.
So today I thought I'd talk briefly about children's engagement with history through heritage landscapes, both from a historical perspective, but also from contemporary practice too. So as well as the National Trust's custodianship of historic landscapes, over the last 25 years, the National Lottery have invested over £950 million in public parks, historic public parks. And children have often been a key constituent of audience development plans and the subsequent activities and events that happen. But many of these projects rarely engage with the children's playground, often seeing it as an eyesore in historic landscapes, rather than necessarily engaging with its history or relating playgrounds to the way that children play today. Thanks, Ben. So I thought I'd briefly run through some recent research that I undertook my PhD. So I plotted the erratic evolution of the children's playground in Britain through the 19th and 20th centuries. I focused on public spaces for play, so parks, housing estates, rural villages, and the examples that I found are nonetheless relevant because they also now shape previously private landscapes that are in the care of the National Trust, local authorities and others, and the way that children are able to play there. So a very potted, quick history of the playground. In the late 19th century, playground advocates promoted children's gymnasiums in a garden setting, a bit like the one you can see here on the slide. They were often segregated by gender, sometimes supervised, and often located in poor and overcrowded neighborhoods of cities. And their rationale was basically that through exercise and interaction with a curated form of nature, children would overcome the difficulties of city life. Thanks, Ben. By the early 20th century, alternative ideas about public space play space provision were circulating, and they emphasized fun and excitement rather than structured exercise as a route to childhood well-being. Notably, the philanthropic industrialist Charles Wicksteed created a garden suburb on the edge of his hometown in Kettering in Northamptonshire. And in time, he also created a large playground. He filled it with robust metal play equipment made in his own factory, and he named items of equipment things like the joy wheel, jazz swing, and spread them around the park. This parkland setting, with its trees and lawns, was really important to Wicksteed, but as he sold his products around the country, often that association with nature didn't travel quite so well, and they were installed in gravel playgrounds surrounded by fencing. Thanks, Ben. There was one before that, I think. Well, maybe not. Not to worry, don't worry. So by the mid-20th century, thinking had changed again. From the 1930s through to the 1970s, both architects and landscape designers were promoting more creative approaches to play provision, but that was predicated largely on creativity among their adult designers rather than necessarily by children. And particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, adventure playground advocates started to promote new ideas about the nature of childhood. However, by the late 20th century, both nature and adventure had been somewhat trumped by increasing anxiety about children's place in public space. There were concerns about children's safety, as well as a faltering belief in the utopian possibilities of communal landscapes, and many playgrounds were abandoned by both the people that were meant to care for them and children themselves. But importantly, it takes time and money to change the physical world, and so these changing ideas about play-space provision have affected individual sites in different ways and at different times. And so I thought I would briefly and anecdotally introduce a case study of a historic landscape and play provision in it. Thanks, Ben. So Kersney Court on the edge of Dover in Kent is Grade 2 listed landscape designed by Thomas Mawson as a private garden. It included tennis courts, croquet lawns, and historic photos from the early 20th century show both adults and children playing together in the garden. It was transferred to the local authority in the mid-20th century, and a playground was installed at the same time. It included metal equipment and plenty of fencing, as you might expect. Thanks, Ben. In turn, the play space in Kersney Court was replaced with wooden play equipment around 3 years ago as part of a National Lottery funded project to restore the gardens. Both the playful and aesthetic expectations of the new playground were shaped by local children, parents, historic landscape professionals, local authority maintenance staff, councillors and funders. Thanks, Ben. In contrast, just across the road, the picturesque grounds of Kersney Abbey continues to be home to a late 20th century playground with its brightly coloured equipment, something of an island in the expanse of lawns and trees, and that was untouched by the lottery project as there wasn't enough funding. Thanks, Ben. I think this playground that's still there points to the enduring power of historical ideas about place-based provision, but obviously also shapes the way that children are able to play and interact with this historic landscape. At the same time, it also does something, and I'm not sure how valuable it is, but it does something to show that children are at least welcome in this historic landscape and provides a physical statement of their right to play. Next slide, please. At the same time, since the 1970s, sociologists, anarchists, and advocates of child liberation have argued that playgrounds are somewhat incidental to children's lives. Children will play anywhere and with anything. And this line of argument continues through to the present day and is echoed in campaigns to promote child-friendly cities and to try and make entire landscapes more child-friendly. And I'm not sure quite yet how to reconcile my historical research and contemporary practice. And so I thought I would just finish with a couple of questions that might prompt discussion. Next slide, please. So firstly, should we remove playgrounds that mar aesthetic historic landscapes or that deviate from their original design intent, safe in the knowledge that children will still play there? Or secondly, do we need a physical thing in the landscape to signify these are places where children are both welcome and allowed to play? Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Again, a fascinating paper and kind of throwing us into the contemporary, both the historic and the contemporary engagement with heritage as space. So amazing. Thank you so much. And I know colleagues will have questions. We've already got some coming in, but I do encourage everybody to put questions in the chat for both Barbara and John. But next up, we will be hearing from our final speakers today. We have two speakers. We have Aude Le Guenec and Claire Rose, who are going to be talking to us about learning through clothes, engaging the perspectives of children on heritage clothing collections in a post-pandemic world. Aude leads the programme Future Heritage at Glasgow School of Art. She publishes extensively and shares her research on inclusive, participative and sustainable children's fashion internationally. And Claire is a historian of dress and of childhood and the author of Making, Selling and Wearing Boys' Clothes in Late Victorian England and Children's Clothes since 1750. She's pioneered the use of quantitative and cross-disciplinary methods to investigate historic clothing and runs courses on dress history for the V&A Museum in London. So Aude and Claire, I can see you both there. Will one of you be sharing some slides? Wonderful, thank you, Aude. Over to you both.
Sorry, I'm just trying to, my connection is unstable, so hopefully it will work. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, and we can see your slides. If you
okay, I'm gonna start the
okay.
the
If you have any issues though, we can share them from our end too. So we've got the presenter view at the moment, but that doesn't matter too much. But just with
okay, does that change because it's changed my side?
No, it's come up with the we can see the next slide and the current slide. Ah,
okay, right. Here we go. Can you
Perfect.
see my...
Ideal. Wonderful. Thank you.
Apologies about that. And I think Claire will introduce the talk.
Aude and I are talking about a collaborative project that we're involved in. I'm looking at the history of children's clothing, and she's looking at ways to engage children with heritage and with dress today. And this is a summary of some work we're doing in our international research group, Into Frock, which is bringing a lot of very interesting perspectives from different areas. And I'm going to let Aude present, and then I will, of course, be available to answer any questions.
We've got the separate view again, Aude, just to say, could you do the view you did before so we can see the full screen?
Yes, sorry,
It's okay. It's done it again. We're seeing the presenter view.
Yeah. Voilà.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I think Claire, it's you starting the
the
presentation.
Yeah, I come into this from a situation where I've been working on historic collections of children's clothes for a very long time, actually since the 1980s. And one of the interesting but slightly dispiriting things about trying to study historic children's garments is that there are such huge gaps in the collections that are available through museums and archives. And unfortunately, my experience in the UK has been replicated with Aude's experience in France. And a particular problem is that most of the clothes that survive are from elite children's groups, and even from elite practice within those groups, so that you have, for example, the special velvet suit worn by a middle-class boy as page boy at his sister's wedding. You don't have the tweed suit that you wore every day. Still less do you have the clothes that the maid's younger brother wore every day surviving. And I mean, I'm talking here about items from before 1920. And of course, with the passage of time, it becomes practically impossible to find surviving examples of these missing items. So some solutions that we're proposing. One is to research and contextualize the garments that do survive, so that we have a clearer understanding of what they do represent and what they don't represent. Finding evidence of what was done in the past, even when the clothes themselves don't survive, what children thought of this, and then developing interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary methods for research on children's material culture, and adopting a child-centered perspective on children's material culture museums. So next slide, Aude. Yeah, this the pillar 4 slide. Okay, and I'm using, yes, thank you. This as a very small example I've published on this garment, which is a child's pinafore, and this is an item that survives in quite large numbers. This example is from the V&A, and it's quite easy to contextualize it by looking at the advertising of similar garments in mail order catalogues. And these mail order catalogues can tell us a lot. They can tell us about the variety of garments that were available. They can tell us about the ages for which these garments were available. And they can also tell us about the pricing, which may seem nominal, but the pricing here starts at 1 shilling and 8p, which is about 8% of a working class family's weekly budget. Next slide. And another approach that I've used extensively is the quantitative analysis of documents like this, where you have a class photograph. In this case, wonderfully, you have the location of the school, you have a date, and you have the position within the school. This is standard 7. And it's easy enough, if you get a good quality photograph, to go through and to quantify what the children are wearing in this photograph, so that you can say there are so many of them that are wearing jerseys, there are so many of them that are wearing dresses, there are so many of them that are wearing pinafores over their dresses, which may seem trivial, but actually if you get a range of photographs over time or over age groups, it can actually allow you to track the clothing behavior of children. And I'm particularly keen on these class photographs, because not only do they allow you to compare practice with it between families, they also include children whose families probably did not have the money to buy individual family portraits. Next slide. And then that, I think, is particularly important when you try to use autobiographies. I'm very wary about the use of autobiographies. They're very tempting because they have all these wonderful details and wonderful opinions, like this woman, Elizabeth Harrison, born in 1902, who talks about pinafores as being a makeshift that hid the wear and tear on a dress, which sounds very convincing. But there are many problems with autobiographies. One of them is that they are extremely selective. There are actually very few child autobiographies from the period before 1920. Another major problem is the delay between the experience and the time when the experience was written down, which could be 50 years, it could be 60 years, it could even be longer. And the third problem with these texts is the very understandable tendency of the authors to shape their experience into a story. And of course, the more the autobiography has been written with publication in view, the more it tends to be shaped, and in some cases to the extent that it falsifies the historical experience of the author. Next slide, Aude. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, so with after having made this diagnostic, Claire from a British perspective and myself from a French perspective as the director of the Fashion Museum in Cholet in the western part of France, we ended up, both of us, each of us in our remits and our realms, we ended up trying to find solutions in order to create a methodology where we could both analyze and refocus on on children's perception about their clothing heritage and their interactions. And eventually, in 2021, I've been invited by Accorso, Body and Appearance, to create a network, an interdisciplinary and international network for the research on children and clothing called Into Frog. And this network gathers historians, anthropologists, sociologists, ethnologists, museum curators, but also childhood practitioners, designers, and representatives of the fashion industry in order to together to investigate into children and clothing across the globe, time and social ecosystems. This network aims to create new disciplinary methodologies in order not only to be able to analyze children's clothing heritage, but also understand what the interpretation that children have about their heritage. Sorry, I hope you can still hear me okay. So there's a website here where you can find more about Into Frog, and I will give you a few examples of what we are currently doing and what we are planning in order to foster this research and to create these innovative methodologies. So an example of where we started with is very nicely presented in the Object of the Month, which is a series of workshops held via social media and has enabled Into Frog to navigate the conundrum of investigating 3D objects virtually. These workshops aim to address the following question: what can be learned about past childhood from research on archives of historic garments and documents? And you can see here a few examples of the type of objects we've analyzed, from fancy dresses created by children in the context of a workshop with Studio Abi to photographs from Bulgarian pioneer uniform in 1976 or 19th century archives and more creative contemporary examples. We are also developing at the moment pilot projects like Tell Me, and I think that this resonates with examples which were presented before, which is a child-led project which invites children to engage with other cultures via their clothes and dress codes. It's organized under the umbrella of Designing for Children's Rights, and we have created Scottish and French local chapters in order to be able to work from their perspective on children's rights and create an ethical framework to this kind of pilot projects. I could also speak to you about Dress for Homeschooling, which was a project held during the lockdown, where we investigated children's perception of what they were wearing during this period of compulsory homeschooling, and how they could identify their favorite outfits in a very unprecedented context. This will be presented in the exhibition Dressed for School, which will open in June 2023 in Rouen in France, and will be accompanied by a publication. So to conclude, after this extremely quick presentation of what we are doing at Intrufrock, I would like to say that through these activities, Intrufrock aims to address these questions. And just as the presenter before us, it's purely questions that I've got here, and the work will have to be done after that. What can school-aged children learn from history, clothing, and clothing documents? How can we, researchers and practitioners, engage with children to foster a reciprocal learning on children's clothing heritage and material culture, thanks to bespoke methods and well-considered technologies? How can the interpretation of material history with and by children provide a sense of both the reality and the otherness of the past? So these are the questions that, as this interdisciplinary network, we are prioritizing, and where we start from to develop a program of pilot projects. We would like to envisage a better representation of children in museums' collections, as it's essential, especially from a clothing perspective, and foster children's engagement with an interpretation of museums' collection to envisage their social role and cultural agency. And I would like also to open to the necessity to include the education, to include within children's education this approach to clothing, as this is an element, a vital element of our society. These are a few references for your information. Some of them are forthcoming, and you will be happy to read them during the summer, all being good. And these are our contact details and website should you wish to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aude and Claire. That was absolutely fascinating. And I again, I know we'll have lots of questions. And if all of you can, I'm just going to look. I can see you all now. That's perfect. All of you today have really been thinking about kind of the embodied experience of children, I guess, in different ways, through kind of playing and the kind of very fun element, through to kind of, well, play through games, and then play through physical games and being in space, and then that idea of the clothes that children wear every day and that kind of embodied experience they have. So we were really keen to hear from you all together. And I wondered, we have some great questions in the Q&A, which I will come on to, but I wondered if I could ask a broad question of kind of all of you to start with. You were all talking in different ways about kind of adults defining or creating either experiences or spaces or clothing for children, and I wanted to know, have you come across kind of evidence, or are you interested in examples where children may have been consulted in the creation of their own spaces or experiences in the past, or are you very much kind of looking at spaces that were entirely designed, or objects or clothing that was entirely kind of formed by adults? I don't know if that's if anyone wants to come in on that.
Well, I suppose I could
John,
speak
yeah.
from a clothing. Sorry, I could speak from a clothing perspective, and this is actually what we are trying to do at the moment within To Frog, designing for children's rights. One of our members, Anne-Charlotte Hartmann, Studio Abbey, is working with groups of children as extracurricular activities for them to create their own clothes with a very important, genuine, child-centered approach. And that's also what we wanted to understand in Dressed for Homeschooling, that what we are aiming for in Object of the Month, if we can do that, but there are some ethical issues around this. We would like to precisely understand what children do and how they interpret their clothing, and we would like also to create methodologies where children are at the heart of the creative process, so that we can unfilter the approach that children have of their clothes. And this is also the problem of the museum's collection at the moment, but I'm sure that Claire will speak about that.
Yeah, my research has been for the period before 1920, and what comes through completely consistently in historical record is that children's input into clothing was minimal, and that was largely because of the relatively high cost of clothing, and also because of children's shared understanding alongside their parents that clothing was very important as a reflection of family status. And so on the whole, they understood that their parents wanted them to dress in certain ways to reflect well on their family status. Sometimes, of course, the children disagreed when, for example, the parents got things wrong. They got age-related practices wrong. But yeah, on the whole, there was very little input. And Laura Ugolini's work on adolescence has shown that even when adolescents were already working, their input into clothing choices would be strictly limited.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Odd. John, I know you're about to come in on that as well.
I was. The short answer is no. In most of the research, I've done on the history of the playground, I think from the earliest ideas in the mid-19th century about creating public spaces for children through to the middle of the 20th century, adults definitely thought they knew best. They knew that play shouldn't happen in certain places like the street. They knew how it should happen. It should be, either rational in the 19th century park or perhaps exercise based in the late 19th century playground. So I don't think there's no evidence that I've come across, at least, of children being involved in the process of designating or designing places for them. I think that changed in the mid 20th century as ideas of, from progressive education in the interwar years sort of started to have broader influence, and the adventure playground movement is perhaps the most extreme example of, creating a space where children in theory could do what they liked. They could dig holes in the ground, build what they wanted, but that was a very short-lived experiment, really. in the mid 20th century. One of my favorite bits of insight into this, I think, came from Veerhold, the sociologist in the 1960s. And she did some work looking at how children play on high density housing estates. And she likened the children's playground to the pub. And she said that children drifted into the playground to hang out with their friends, to socialize, but then drifted out to do other things. And so it was one part of children's, day-to-day lives. And so, adults might have thought children should play there, but children had all sorts of other ideas. Yeah.
Great, thank you, John. And Barbara, have you come across any examples in the games you've been looking at?
Yeah, so the games that I look at are obviously quite prescriptive, but we do know that children didn't always interact with the games in the ways that you would want. For example, there's a lot of evidence of children's writing or on games. Sometimes they'll write names, they'll write roar, they'll write different things. And there's also evidence of people changing the rules of the games. And this could be adults or children, so modifying rules and gameplay. So we have that, and it's something I've tried to or allude to in the game again, because of course, when you're playing it on a computer game, it is in a way more prescriptive because, things like potential for a future, create your own curiosity or things like that have that creative element that could be engaged with in a way that maybe a child might play the game differently. So yes.
Great, thank you, everybody. Going to the Q&A, we have quite a few questions, and there's two that I wanted to start with. I'm going to just read them both out in case anyone can't access it. These are both, John, related to your talk. So one may slightly answer the other, but this is quite interesting for me. So we have a question from Emma Lipscomb. Emma, I believe you're from the National Trust, but I might have got that wrong, but Emma says, we're changing our property to reduce the formal playground and introduce play in all aspects of the grounds. Are there any interesting examples of play interventions in the landscape that you've come across in your research? So that's question one. And then we have another question that kind of might give a good example, actually, but also that is for you to answer, John. So the second question is from Lyndon Groves. Lyndon says, John, can you think of any examples where the surviving playground in a historic park is arguably of equal interest and survival to the rest of the historic landscape? So maybe thinking about listing there. I don't know if you've been involved in anything around that, but Lyndon says there is a fabulous 1930s playground surviving largely intact at Thompson Park in Burnley, but my experience is that most historic playgrounds have been reworked many times, and even that at Wicksteed Park. Thank you for your talk.
I think the second question answers the first, in that Lyndon has published some brilliant advice and guidance in a document called Beyond the Playground that looks exactly at Emma's question, really. It's got lots of suggestions for ways to think differently about play provision in historic landscapes. Moving beyond swing, slides and roundabouts to think of a far more holistic approach to a garden and how it might be playful. So I think, Emma, head to Lyndon's website. I don't know if you can access a copy of it there, but I'm sure there'll be links to it. The best example near me is Walmer Castle, where there isn't a playground per se, but there are playful things dotted around the garden. So that's probably a good place to start as well. In terms of Lyndon's question, I don't know of any where the kind of, say, original playground is still intact. Although I said in my presentation that it's quite hard to change the real world. It takes time and money. Playgrounds are one of the things that are relatively easy to change. It doesn't take too much time and money to pull out some old kit and put in new. So I think during my research, I've sort of imagined, and I'm not sure this is legitimate, but I've sort of imagined present day playgrounds a bit like an archaeological site. And there's layers of sort of history there. So the swings that you might see in a present day playground are probably just a reworked version of something from the 19th century. So that there's sort of physical references to the past, but also certain expectations around behavior and where's appropriate to play and where's not. And that final point was something I was going to say to Emma. I think it's as much about getting away from the old-fashioned idea of parks departments that tried to keep people off of the grass or under it, depending on their, parks versus cemeteries functions. And I think that sense of sort of Victorian decorum is still really pervasive in a lot of public parks, and particularly so in historic landscapes where, I think there's a sense that maybe children are expected to behave. So if there's anything you can do to change that culture, to make a place feel more welcoming to children and make play more legitimate, I think that would be a really good step. I don't know how you do it. It's very hard, but those are the two things.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the questions. I've got another question here from Professor Sumit Mukherjee, and it's for Claire and Aude. The question is about whether children, you spoke about wanting to move away actually from the kind of elite children's clothing to kind of tell those broader stories. But the question is around whether these kind of garments of quote a great man, do they stimulate a sense of history, and can you actually use them maybe to then go beyond that to open up narratives, or are you entirely trying to move away from the kind of the great owner narrative or that kind of elite space?
I think Aude should start with her experience on the Charles de Gaulle collection.
Oh yeah, sorry, you were breaking up. I hope it's still okay. You can hear me? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, just now, I would like to research more on the perception that children have of historical collections. It's really something that I think might be extremely important. But with regard to Charles de Gaulle, I have been working on the christening dress of Charles de Gaulle for the Maison Natale in Lille. And this is a kind of iconic garment which is in their collections and displayed there. And it is extremely interesting how they're using these iconic garments to document for children the life of this historical figure. So in that situation, I don't know if this answers the question precisely, but you can see how a garment can be representative of a historical moment and a historical figure, and how for children this does make sense. So eventually they realize that this person has been real and has been a child and has been wearing this kind of outfits, even though during the expertise we were not very sure in the end what this was really. But this is another story. I would also, coming back to another question about the sensorial interpretation and interaction in the showcase in the museum's collection because of their fragile aspect. I believe that we also need to understand how we could use other ways to interact with the collections in order to convey this, the sensations of the child, who the child is learning by doing very much. So sometimes the replica of the collection in order for a child to understand how this works on the body and the weight, etc., is not necessarily the good answer. And it would be interesting to rethink the collection in terms of facilitating the interaction between children and these objects, and making sure that they've got a good sense of what it was, how it was from a sensorial perspective. And again, there are lots of research opportunities to have there, and this would be extremely timely.
Brilliant. Claire, do come on.
Yeah, I have a slightly different viewpoint. I think, although, as Aude says, it can be very powerful to see a particular garment worn by a particular person, though I do worry that this elides into a kind of cult of relics, rather like the cult of relics you have in all sorts of religious shrines. But I think that this needs to be framed by a much clearer understanding of how this one garment relates to the typical experience of other children, so that you might, on the one hand, have to comment that this beautiful, finely embroidered, long white christening gown was not typical in the wardrobe even of an elite baby who would normally, day to day wear something a lot simpler, and certainly not typical of the wardrobe of 90% of the population of France in 1900. On the other hand, I've read people writing the most ahistorical comments about photographs of Oscar Wilde in a dress at the age of 3, and talking about how this clearly predetermines his homosexuality, which is complete nonsense, because that particular practice was completely normative. There was nothing strange or pejorative or particular in any way about an upper class child in the 1860s having a dress up to the age of 3, 4, even 6. So that I think that, as I say, we need to be much clearer about what is normative about these garments, what is specific about these garments. And also we do, as Aude says, need to be very clear that when we present something as having been worn by X, it actually was. There's a historic display not very far from me that presents something, a garment, as having been worn by daughter of a famous man. But as you look at the garment, you can clearly see that the white underdrawers have a fly front and that it was for a boy. And this famous person did not have a son. So this tells us that this garment could not have been worn by his daughter. So I think I'll leave it there.
That point around authenticity is one we're very interested in too, Claire, through our partnership. So thank you. I was just going to say, actually, to John and Barbara. Sorry. Yeah, please do come in, Aude.
No, I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say very, very briefly, this is an example of the discussions, the in-depth and vivid discussions we've got at Into Frog, where we are listening from a variety of point of view, and this gives us the idea of the projects, innovative projects we're doing, and new methodologies which are coming up.
Wonderful, thank you. I was just going to say that I'm hearing you talk, Claire, about the fact that these are not you said that they're not necessarily the typical experience of the kind of wider group of people, and I wondered, John and Barbara, if you've been thinking about this in your own work. So Barbara, they seem like very elite spaces, the games that you've been looking at. From what I can see, that the sites tend to be, are they for elite children, or are they for any children to engage with? And likewise, John, does your research look particularly at a type of social group, or are you looking at children's experiences across the kind of social strata? I don't know if either of you wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah, so the games I look at, particularly from the 18th and early 19th century, are made for elite and middle-class children. That's in terms of the cost of the games and things like that. And as you could see from the scenes in London, these are all things that require fees and fares and things to get into. So it's a very aspirational kind of experience or game. So, but I guess another way to think about it as well is that some of the children who may come from middle class audience may not be visiting London, but it's a way to virtually visit. But still, the people who are virtually visiting can afford these games. So that's something. Of course, game prices not in my period, but later on are more affordable. But for the ones that I'm looking at, they're very much used in home education, and they're used for middle class and elite audiences. And it is something to think about when you're adapting the game, because of course you're thinking about a particular experience and embodying the particular experience of a child in this period, but of course with the acknowledgement that the child in this period that you might have your name associated with is going to be experiencing a London that might be very different from other kinds of children. So the concept that this could be used in tandem with a lot of other educational material as well, or a talking point, is important.
Perfect, thank you. John, did you want to say something about which children are you thinking about when you've done yours?
Yeah, sure. I suppose I think the idea of the playground probably came about as a lot of sort of social welfare did in the late 19th century, I guess, with elite concern for the working class, poor inhabitants of cities. So there quite a few playground advocates were particularly concerned with the future of the empire and the future of the nation, and working class children's ability to be the factory workers or the soldiers that would sustain both nation and empire. So I think that sort of 1880s, 1890s, there was a definite sense that they were aimed at particular children in particular places. It was poor kids in cities. I think as you get into the 20th century and between the wars, there's a tendency for the idea of the playground to become more universal. So I think in terms of geography, there was a definite shift out of the cities, and campaigners felt that children everywhere needed to have access to a playground. So you had lots of schemes of rural communities putting playgrounds into their village because the village green had been lost as a place to play, or former estates that might have, you know, informally allowed people to use their land no longer did. So there needed to be a designated place for children to play. And then as the 20th century wears on, I think, you know, as ideas about child development evolve and our ideas about childhood change, comprehensive education, you know, education for everyone, gradually playgrounds start to be seen as something that all children need, you know, play being important to children's development. So I think it goes from being targeted at very specific groups of children in very specific places and reflecting social norms, so being segregated by gender often, through to the 20th century where I think playground advocates imagine that they're more universal spaces for all children, but with the caveat that, you know, they were only one part of children's lives in practice. So yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question here for Barbara. So it's a question from Lyndon Groves. And Lyndon says, Barbara, did you find historic board games to cover areas other than London? I am hoping you will say Brighton, as I am looking to possibly develop an online heritage visit game for teenagers there. So places outside of London.
So there are tours, many tours of England, for example, and all of those would have Brighton on them. I just checked a few of them earlier on, and they all do have Brighton, but Brighton would be one spot out of 120 or 117. I haven't come across a specific one like London where you would have all the sites, but that sounds like a fascinating project, and it might be interesting to have teenagers actually create their own game for contemporary other teenagers of different heritage sites, or what sites they consider important, as a kind of reworking of this game. But sadly Brighton is there, but it's only there as one of 100 on the Tours of England.
So there is an opportunity then to create something new there. Perfect. There are a couple of more questions from Summit Mukherjee, and I know that Claire has been is answering one of them online. So keep an eye on there. I've got a really quick question here for John from Kira Vaklovic, who says, is there a sense that playgrounds were a place for children of different classes to come together, based on the comments you just made?
That's true, yes. Particularly probably in the 19th century, there was this sort of idea that hanging out with your betters would somehow make you better. And I think that's probably, perhaps in part at least, comes from the public park movement. You know, that was an important driver for creating public parks. These were spaces where people of different classes would mix, and by a sort of undefined process of osmosis, hanging out with people that were better than you would make you better. And so I think that is seen in some of the 19th century playgrounds, you know, as a rationale for them. Later on, there's less evidence of that, I think. But one of the things I kind of wanted to ask Barbara and the others was their experience of working with archives and trying to find out, you know, answers to questions like that, because, you know, in my experience, you very rarely get much in the archives that tells you about children's experience of using playgrounds, their thoughts about them, and so you're often looking for creative ways to read the archive to get a sense of that. And I know Barbara touched on the way that children perceive the use of games. It would be interesting to hear a little bit, if it's not out of place, a little bit about how you found out what children thought about the games that you were researching, for instance.
Yeah, it's can be quite challenging. So for example, there are marks on the games. So children often wrote their names on particular games. And for one of the games that I looked at, I was able to track the family that owned the game in the archive in Montreal. And so I could tell like which children were using the game, and they'd marked up the outside of the game. But that's very lucky. Literature is also very useful. So for example, there are a number of things where you can look at how I did some stuff on bricks and blocks and building bricks and recreating heritage sites through blocks, and kind of these instructive lessons which children were supposed to read, of course, and then imitate. So building like Kenilworth or something out of blocks. So that's another way in that I found. And then occasionally you will get things like governess or different reports about children and people who taught children who created games. And yeah, I think that's most of it. And then I guess one other very interesting one in the Bodleian was a penitentiary. So it had a mark that this had been used or donated or given to this place in order. So it would be women, working class women, who would have this game, I guess, in the penitentiary. I don't know how often it was played, but it was just interesting to connect that. But again, it can be quite challenging, but there are sometimes clues you can follow up in the archives.
Thanks both, and we're always very pleased for our panelists to answer each other's questions, so please always do that. Claire would like to answer one of the questions we've got in the chat about the role of autobiography and whether autobiographies, there are examples that focus entirely on childhood, and if there are any sources that you use in your own research, Claire. So do you want to come in on that one?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. John Burnett's collection, Destiny Obscure, is a very good starting place for looking at this, because he gathers together many autobiographies that are completely unpublished, and it's a little bit vague in the way he describes them, but it's clear that some of them are purely childhood accounts and some of them are accounts the whole of the life course. In the early 20th and mid 20th century, there was actually a bit of a publishing fad for childhood autobiographies, many of which are used in various publications. Molly Weir was one of them. M.V. Hughes was another. Then, of course, there's Flora Thompson's Lark Rise to Candleford. And these discuss the author's childhood at extraordinary length. They were published in book form. They sold extremely well. And so they appear on the face of it to be very good and very tempting, shall we say, sources. The problems come when you dig a little bit deeper. Both Molly Hughes and Flora Thompson gloss over some of the less savory aspects of their childhood experience, which included an alcoholic father, an abusive father, younger siblings who died in early childhood. And these just kind of completely written out of the narrative. And not only that, in some cases, flatly denied that this sort of thing ever happened. At which point, I feel that we should be very, very cautious in the way that we interpret these written accounts, which, as I've said, create a story, they create a narrative, they create a story about the author, and they also create a published product that the author is hoping to use for, in many cases, their own financial gain. So I will just leave that there.
That's right. That's great, Claire. So some good leads, but a word of warning as well as using them as a historic record. Perfect. I've got one very final question for all of you. So I'd love a very quick answer, if it's okay, and then we will wrap up for today. So the question is from Sian Pooley, who I've co-convened the program with. So Sian has asked, can you tell us about material culture and age? So do the sources you use tell us anything about how childhood experiences were differentiated by age and the boundaries of childhood? Or do they present a monolithic image of what the child wants? So I don't know, who would any of you like to kind of come in on that final very big question? Headline thoughts. Barbara, I see you've unmuted. Over to you first.
It's a head scratch, but sure.
Yeah.
No, it's very interesting because a lot of the games, I mean, as they were originally intended that I look at, you do have the earlier bricks and blocks and things that are intended for much younger children, but you also have a lot of the games that just seem to have this childhood age range. So these are the ones I'm speaking about, which are produced by children's publishers for children's education. So younger children. But there was a very interesting game that I came across, and I can't remember the name of it. It was a historical game, and it offered two sets of rules, one for younger children and one for older children, which I found really interesting. So there was this kind of acknowledgement that that these games, you know, might not be appropriate or interesting to older children, or younger children might need different kinds of rules or simpler rules. And so this was something that this particular game had, wherein you actually saw that boundary. And there's also a lot of pedagogical discussion about games being easier than books for children, and that's why games are a good way to educate. So I'll just leave that on.
Would anyone else like to come in next? John, over to you.
I just thought one of the really interesting things for me that pointed to the changing nature of childhood over time, but also the, you know, breaking childhood down into categories, was a lot of the thinking around playground provision across the middle of the 20th century on housing estates. Often talked about playgrounds for young children being within sight of the kitchen window, so that mothers could carry on with their work in the kitchen while their young children were able to play within eyesight. And I think what's really fascinating is that those young children were really young by today's standards. You know, often the playground designers were thinking of children that might be 2 or 3 or 4 being allowed out to play in public spaces. You know, there was a definite sense that that was normal and acceptable and part of everyday life. So definitely later in the playground story, there is sort of a separation of children by age, and it tells us some really interesting stories about social norms and expectations around parenting and childhood, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. And Claire, over to you.
Not surprisingly, age is incredibly important in the discussion of clothing, and that's something that I worked on extensively when I did my PhD on 19th century boys' clothes. And what I found was that there were very, very clear understandings among consumers, that's to say, children and their families, around what kind of clothing was appropriate for a particular age of child, even when that particular type of garment was available to buy at a much wider range of sizes. So you might have an outfit that was available sizes for age up to 11, but was only worn by children up to age 8. And this is where the school photographs are so helpful, because they allow you to see how this worked out in a particular place at a particular time. And so I would like to close by saying that the study of children's clothes is really important, because the work done by clothing in the past was to situate a child in terms of a gender continuum, in terms of a class continuum, and in terms of an age continuum. And you have to unpick the historic understandings of all three of these before you can even start to analyze what it is you're looking at.
Thank you so much, Claire. That unpicking, physical and metaphorical, I think is perfect with the history of dress. And then, Odd, did you have anything you wanted to kind of add to finish our conversation today?
Well, no, not really. I think the perception that children, obviously what I wouldn't like here is to objectify childhood. It's extremely important to understand that you can't speak about a molecular childhood. Is sorry, a block. You have to envisage childhood in a very organic manner, and actually you have to envisage children in their interaction with the rest of the world, interaction with adults, interaction with their environment. And I think that's what is fascinating in clothing, because you have the garment in the middle, clothing in the middle, and you have the educator, you have the parents, you have the industry, and you have the child, and eventually changing the perspective on childhood and looking at this environment from a child's point of view can provide you with further insights into their material culture. So I wouldn't think childhood in terms of segments and gender. I would think childhood as a community, as a kind of a organic concept almost, and I would consider their material culture from this perspective, if I may.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And thank you to all four of you. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I've been very pleased that I got to chair it and join the conversation with you. I would like to thank all of our brilliant speakers today. In wrapping up, we definitely will finish by 5 o'clock, so I'm going to be very speedy. But I wanted to just say how listening today, it's really opened up questions about the role of childhood in defining what heritage is, about thinking about children as consumers and contributors to heritage. Really interested by the interdisciplinary approaches, and we've had colleagues today from all different academic and professional backgrounds, and we will have the same again tomorrow. I liked the ideas that we've been exploring around imagination and creativity versus authenticity, contested heritage, and definitions of heritage as well, and expanding those traditional concepts right from the start of today, thinking about placemaking and intangible cultural heritage, including language and storytelling in particular, and then also that tension between entertainment and education, which we had earlier on today, which was really fascinating. We've gone on to think about which histories do we engage children with, and how children actually engage with those histories themselves. Themes of gender, race and empire have come through, and children's agency, nostalgia, and also the role of childhood in that topic of nostalgia, a particularly hot topic for the heritage sector. We're really looking forward to seeing some of you tomorrow in person and again online if you're able to join us. So we will be back on Zoom, and we will be in Magdalen College in Oxford tomorrow from tomorrow morning. Our session will begin tomorrow with a keynote from Caro Howell, who is the director of the Foundling Museum, and then we're going to go on to explore children as heritage visitors, interpreting children's spaces, childhood and engagement with popular culture, and how we can engage children with heritage today. So please do, as I said before, join us on Twitter as well if you're interested. Thanks to Isabel and Joanna who have been tweeting today, and many thanks to Ben behind the scenes who's been helping with the Zoom, which is really helpful. Look, we've got 2 minutes to go, so how good is that? It's really great to see you all here, and lots of familiar faces and lots of new people as well who I've not met before, and I know many of you will be interested in meeting each other through this really interesting theme that's brought us all together. So thank you all very much. We hope to see you tomorrow. If not, we will see you at some point soon, and I hope you have a really wonderful evening. Goodbye.